Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fourth session of Brain Awareness Week, organized by Dana Foundation alongside International Brain Research Organization and Federation of European Neurosciences Society. This week is organized with the support of Gujarat Forensic Sciences Universities and our Great Brain Awareness Week team. I'm Anjali Salot, a member of organizing team for this event and a neuropsychology student from Gujarat Forensic Sciences Universities, and I'll be a moderator for this session. So, due to some technical and weather difficulties, Momita ma'am couldn't be here. So, due to the non-reliability of internet connections and cyclone devastations across Kolkata, she isn't here. So, on behalf of her, we have Miss Pranjali S. Kulkarni. She's a PhD scholar at IIT Gandhinagar. Her research area is cognitive linguistic. So, um, topic for today's seminar is a short story of dominant epistemologies of language and cognition. We thank Ms. Pranjali S. Kulkarni to be here on such short notice. Thank you. Ma'am, you can begin.
Okay, just give me a minute. It seems that I can hear an echo from your voice.
Okay.
So let me just fix it in a minute and we'll start.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Are you guys able to see my presentation?
We'll fix it. 1 second. Just give it a few minutes.
Yeah.
Pranjali, can you share your screen again for the presentation?
Yeah. Yeah. Doing that. Are you guys able to see it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I can still hear two voices, but okay. Just let me start with this.
Can you just actually? I can see two screens.
I know. It's
Yeah,
stuck. I'm sorry.
it's okay. It's okay. Take your time.
I have actually uploaded it already on the platform, so if I can access it there, it would be great.
There must be some network issues, but for now, it's better if you upload it. I
Oh
mean,
God,
just stay
what is?
there.
Okay, I don't know what's happening. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. Calm down.
No, it's just the screen stuck. Okay, can you see this now?
Yeah, yeah. Can you just
I'll
go
just
to the slide? I mean,
yeah get it here.
slide share. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the problem still existing? Okay,
Just
can
give
you
it.
guys see it now properly?
Yeah, it's visible.
No.
It is visible.
Okay, it's still. I'm extremely sorry for this.
It's already sorry. It
I don't
usually
know. It's the
happens.
it, Okay, finally. Can you see the screen properly now?
Yeah,
Is it
it's
okay
visible.
now?
It's
Okay.
visible. You can start.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, okay. Thanks for bearing with all of this. And I'm here to talk about how language is actually studied in brain research and cognitive science. Um, so I've curated this in a very short span of time. So uh, I don't know how well it's organized, but it will still like bring up a nice story, and I hope all of you will get something out of this. So let's start. So this story basically I'm going to talk about what are the dominant approaches in brain and language research. So, uh, because I'm focusing on cognitive science, let's start with 1950s, where actually the major language war kind of started, where um, Chomsky brought linguistics into cognitive science. And hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. Sorry, it's just getting cut in between. So, okay. Yeah. So, around that time, another field was developing that was generative semantics. So, we all know about generative grammar as such, it's the core or the traditional linguistics, the core of traditional linguistics. But what was this generative semantics? Um, so basically, a group of researchers, linguists, and psychologists together tried to develop something, a structural format of semantics, alike what generative grammar was already existing. And that study or that research later converted into cognitive linguistics. So just let's just see what the cognitive linguistics consists of. Um, Beginning with it, it's a hub of all the cognitive functions. So it studies language as a hub of all the cognitive functions. It does not believe in separate modules of having language and other functions in the mind. But this was very critical of Chomsky perspective of language because all of it was super structured and well represented in terms of different modules and parts in the brain. While cognitive linguistics was, focusing on meanings and truth conditional semantics and conceptualizations, where the key focus was on understanding language in terms of different aspects of it, like acquisition, memory, comprehension, speech, writing, and multiple parts together rather than dividing it in structures. Um, so basically, this wave kind of challenged everything that generative linguistics was trying to put up, and generative linguistics kind of was a well fit with the then new emerging cognitive science field because it was very compatible with the computational field of uh, cog science, and we also had AI, which could, take the structural approach and design very sophisticated language in artificial devices. So this was not given so much importance, and cognitive linguistics kind of got like a setback during that time, and the structural linguistics was kind of appreciated more. So this kind of cognitive linguistics overall focuses more on the communication-based approach and what's important in terms of meaning and how meaning derives out of communication, and kind of a holistic approach. But as I said, the cognitive linguistics lost the race with structural linguistics. So let's see how and why this happened. Um, Basically, if you look at how our speech or how our language functions in everyday life, it's just, for example, me talking, you listening, and in fraction of seconds, all the aspects of language are being processed, and that is an amusing thing. So there are multiple things, right, that we got out of structural linguistics. Also, it focuses on as broad concepts as sentence structures or paragraph structures, and it can go into smallest units like phonemes and morphemes, and then the complexities of it at different levels. So if you can just see this model from Jamie Watt's work, you will be able to see that, just a mere unit of communication can involve so many steps if you go through the, even if you go through the idea of generative linguistics. And it's amusing that how all of this can be fit into, you know, all these random sounds and symbols and units can fit into such a complex thing called as language. Uh, so what helped the best to understand these complex structures and this, melody of units working together to form a language uh, was the structural approach, and hence it was preferred more than the cognitive linguistics approach. So if you see, we have this beautifully structured theory from Chomsky, which helped us, let it borrow in cognitive sciences, and we could do brain research just based on that. Um, so just getting into what this theory was, if you see in this small, structural sentence or this small rule, he has actually captured what all of language could be framed as. It's transformative, transformational or generative grammar, which includes phrase structures and the transformations working on it. So basically, you have content in a sentence which is there, and different rules which work on the sentences. And anything in any language can be understood through this perspective, and hence this approach was then accepted globally. And then there were a lot of questions about what about the other aspects, right? It's not just processing of sentences, it's all also about comprehending, it's also about listening, it's also about having an understanding of the concepts themselves. But he justified it by saying that, language acquisition with growth and maturity, how we develop all other cognitive functions, will develop concepts about language also, and we have this specialized device and specialized capacities biologically in us, which will help us gain the language structurally in a particular format. So yeah, um, but still, these global rules were kind of opposed during 1970s, mainly through the fields of pragmatics and semantics. But he then tweaked his own theory and said that, oh, you know what, in generative semantics, the deep structure that I'm talking about, it's not just, categorizing the semantics, but it's also producing the semantic concepts, and uh, it is the main hub of where the concepts are being produced. So the questions of where are the, concepts coming from, or how is the structural theory helping us to understand it, was resolved by. And he said any extra linguistic presuppositions, like external objects, like what the context is, where the person is situated, their background, their culture, all of these things on the side wouldn't matter because the structure will work anyways globally, and there is no interaction with the external world or the external objects unless viewed in that way. So we have this beautiful theory, and based on this theory, our psychologists and cognitive scientists then started building on, new models. So first they have to hypothesize from this theory certain ideas of how this theory will actually work out. And I'm just giving examples through uh, all the slides where I talk about only certain parts of what consists in generative grammar or generative linguistics. And these are some of the examples that we can use to see how the journey of generative linguistics was there in cognitive sciences. Okay, so one of the major hypotheses is the lexical way of using language. It's Leverlett's model, and the hypothesis and testing here was again addressing the same question where if there are no direct relations with the objects in the outside world, then how do you build meaning? How are there abstract concepts in your head? You need a reference to something to make meaning out of anything. So this was a sophisticated model where they kind of plugged two things. One is the grounded meaning. Grounded meaning is basically you have an object and you define it in a certain way. So you have a reference to it. It can be any kind of reference. So there are multimodal references, like in multisensory references. And there is an amodal area where the language is being processed. So these are the language specific areas. So initial models developed on the extremes where some of them were, totally talking about the modularity of language, where language is a very special and specific kind of a function. On the other hand, we had the grounded meanings where everything could be referenced into the external world or the context. But the models which thrived the most was, lighting up brain like a Christmas tree, like I say, because it can actually relate to any of the parts or any of the cognitive functions which are apart from the language specific area. So we can see here the language specific area, and if you go around and see in all the other areas, you get sounds, actions. There is, the production area, the motion, color, shape, etc. So when we have this kind of complex relations of, cognitive concepts and language, how do then we structure it in the brain? So again, generative linguistics had an answer for us laid down there, because here there were hierarchies, features and categories laid out for us, which could be then checked and, tested on how the brain works or how the brain processes these categories. So the two things which were mainly studied were the physical properties and the functions. So every concept was divided into two of these parts. And what happened further was there were uh, dissociation studies, basically understanding that, if there are certain properties and you want to separate it from the other properties, how would you do? You give one property and see if it's impacting the other one, or, if one is working, the other is not working. Um, Basically, if I can go through this chart, you can see that, you have a concept, you have functions to it, you have again a broader concept linked to the smaller concept, and the smaller concept again links to a broader concept. So if you see, then you can make a structural tree out of multiple kinds of concepts in terms of the specificities of its structures, functions, and contents. And this was laid out in linguistics already, so it was a good way to adopt it into cognitive science and test if it actually works. So, as I said, then there were like sophisticated theoretical models which kind of could test this. And then how do you, kind of finally speak? How do you actually use this kind of structures, these sophisticated structures in the brain processing language, and understand what's happening? Um, if the models look into how a sentence was processed or spoken, if just retrieving a small unit of the language together, you could see that the base, surface, and transformation, all the basic rules of generative linguistics were right there. And this is how they kind of prove that, our brain is processing language in a structural and a modular way. And when we got into more of neuroimaging and multiple advanced techniques to understand brain research, we have newer empirical insights which could actually show the structural imprints of language in the brain. So if we see here that I showed earlier that, different kind of modalities are kind of linked with the language areas. If you see, these are the dominant language areas that we know of, Broca's and Wernicke's. But there are multiple networks which go through other areas also, and they encompass other cognitive functions. But even at this level of sophistication, if you look into other empirical studies, you can see that they're able to show through different pathways how the hierarchical phrase structure and local phrase structures and lexical phrase semantics are all kind of um, laid structurally into functional processing and structural processing of the brain altogether. So you can see there was like this beautiful one-to-one mapping of how language is understood in linguistics and how it was deciphered and studied for ages in terms of how it can be broken down into structures and how it is processed in the brain. So, like, it was great. You could see that we have great maps of how exactly language could function in the brain. So if you see, even going into the details of it, so the extended morphology, for example, or the derived forms in morphology or the basic morphology. So even in a unit of a linguistic unit, you can see that its different forms and types also had different areas and different networks, which could
Excuse me.
properly, yeah.
Pranjali, can you put it on full screen, the
Oh,
presentation? Actually, people will not be able to see it. It's blurry.
okay, okay.
Okay. Thank
Just
you.
a second.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so just making a point that, these pathways can actually record very intricate details of linguistic units and not just linguistic units. So now we have a picture where there is a theory which structurally lays out language for us. There are different parts of it on which different psychological models were built. From it, communication and speech processes were studied, and further, these communications and speech processes were understood through imaging studies and different brain studies, where you could see that the structures were actually one-to-one mapping on the brain areas and brain networks. So we have like a perfect story of language, right? Then what happened to the cognitive linguists? They were like actually protesting in 70s and 80s, but after the imaging study started, after the empirical study started, the computational approach, their voice was kind of lower down. But if we see now, uh, there are new studies coming up which are hinting towards why cognitive linguistics was important and how we can bring it back. Um, so if you see all of these language specialized areas, as we can see here, Broca's area, which is one of key major areas where actually the study of modularity also started because of Broca the fascia, and we kind of got to know that we have specific modules for cognitive functions. It was all started here in this specialized brain area, but now as the studies are going ahead, we can see that this particular area is not just playing role in one thing. It's producing the language plus it's comprehending it also. It's not just Venike's area which is comprehending it. It's also involved in action, imitation. It's also involved in comprehending movement. And these studies are now backed up by a lot of aphasia and therapy studies where you can see that you know uh, there are multifunctional way of healing these things and not just focusing on one area or one network and its function. So yeah, we have been studying language structurally and we have got beautiful results out of it, but we have other ways to do it also. So if you can see in some recent studies that usually you get, typical activation in the Broca's and Wernicke's area, and the pathways, the dorsal and ventral pathways, which go like this and like this. If you can see my cursor moving, so these are in that way, we kind of use the metaphor of like studying biology of an entire elephant to, if you want to understand what all goes into a sentence, because they were going into the cognitive linguistic approach where you can see that semantics and syntax are not two different things and they are closely working together, especially in phrase structure studies, where concepts determine the structure and structure determines the concept. So one of the interesting finding was that there were different concepts in the brain, but they did not need a structure to process sensibly. So it was very interesting that the typical language areas did light up even if the grammar was wrong or not present in the sentences. So because of this intertwined nature of the syntax and semantics, it becomes difficult to study it in the structural and the beautiful structure laid out way which we had earlier. But nonetheless, we can't ignore it. So we are taking help from the information structure literature, where we know that there is topic and comment in the sentences, and the pragmatic information is packed in the structural and the semantic form of the sentences. And you could see that the typical left lateralized areas would not uh, be functioning when it's a communication setup. Like you can see, the pragmatic information could be seen being processed in typical reasoning areas for that matter. So now that we have this contrasting literature where multiple studies are seeing different theoretical uh, uh, insights, we should probably accommodate this new idea of cognitive linguistics as well. So, kind of cognitive linguistics is doing a comeback, and it deserves a place in the brain science research. Um, so the whole point is, when it started, when this kind of war started, it was always generative linguistics versus cognitive linguistics. But it need not be like that. Now we have come so far from 50s. We know that both of it can, coexist, because we have got brilliant insights from the structural study of language, and we cannot discard it. But at the same time, it's not enough, or it's not a full view of language. We need the parts which are understudied, like semantics and pragmatics, also to be involved in the research further. So we need to understand that both pragmatics and semantics, the meaning and the context of a sentence, also has a structured form and function. So if we take the shelter of logic and philosophy, we could understand that propositions, or the basic propositions in terms of meanings, also have structural properties like predicate structures and truth values and inference and deductive processes. So if the theories are now able to accommodate this, probably we'll be able to address some of these non-dominant approaches to language, that is semantics and pragmatics getting involved. And they will be able to connect it better to the thoughts, and studying language and concepts together with how language in total is getting processed in the brain. So meanings kind of are deriving out of both the structures that are given to us in terms of language, that we learn through language, but also how we use language. Like continuously creating new structures of how language is functioning and how it is used. So with different experimentations, kind of these rules get updated, and uh, we have an holistic kind of an understanding of language with semantics and pragmatics plus the structural approach. So even if these are like vaguer concepts, they can be structured, and the results would not be that arbitrary. So just coming to an end, I would like to point out that so there are infinite forms and functions of concepts that you know of. It's not just about the forms that we know, the lexical forms that we know, or the structured forms that we know, but language, the concepts in language kind of exist beyond language too. And those concepts also are determining the forms and functions of the structures. So these should not be studied separately, and I think a way forward would be bringing this difficult, ambiguous, but yet very, very important aspects of language research back into understanding language in brain sciences. So, yeah, this was a short story of how language research has been happening in cognitive science and brain sciences, favoring the structural approach, but I'm hoping that moving ahead we'll have more semantics and pragmatics. Okay, thank you guys. Anjali?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you, Pranjali, for such an insightful presentation.
yeah.
Most of our audience is from psychology background, so I don't think there'll be that much understanding about linguistics, cognitive linguistics, especially, especially undergrad people.
Okay, okay.
Okay, wait one
Uh,
second. Question. Questions are coming. I'll ask you some questions and then we'll end the session.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. What is your take on sound symbolism?
Okay, this
Yeah.
is a very interesting question. So yes, sound symbolism did have its what do you say merits, but again, it was a restricted approach, and if you see, it again going to okay. I'm extremely sorry. Can you hear and see me properly?
Yeah, you can stop sharing your screen if you like, because
Yeah, it's just like I don't know. It's going weird. Just a second, okay? I'll just answer it. Okay, is this okay? Yeah. Um. So yeah, sound symbolism. It again refers to kind of ostensive in the sense a referential kind of understanding of language, that something's out there, the sounds are being produced, and based on that, the meanings are formed. But that's not always the case. There are certain abstract concepts where sound symbolism would not hold its merits. Um, so yes, some aspects of language can be defined through it, but again, it should not be a comprehensive insight into what language is or how language is processed in the brain altogether. Yeah. I can't hear you.
the second question is language perception in stroke and aphasia.
Okay, so some of the insights that are presented in the later part, like where I was saying that it's important that cognitive linguistics kind of get a comeback. Much of the literature now it's coming from aphasia and stroke studies, where it's being understood that initially it was yes, the language specific areas, there are dominant language specific areas, and they do get affected, but their recovery is now seen through the multifunctional networks or the multifunctionality of the language areas which is being damaged. So they are not just say targeting if there is a production that has been affected, but there are multiple functions now, like with the production they will try to understand also how you comprehend in terms of um, motor words, or how you comprehend in terms of reasoning, because these aspects are also now important in terms of say Broca's aphasia. So different kind of aphasias have different kinds of problems in it, but rather than going into like a focused or a very limited kind of chart of what has to be addressed, now it is addressed in a holistic manner, seeing that it's important to bring all the functions of language together. And sometimes, because thanks to neuroplasticity, other functions do take over these functions and are able to merge and get a midway, where if there's a production problem, you kind of can produce certain sentences and cannot produce certain sentences based on how you recover, say, in terms of concept comprehension or something like that.
Okay. Next question. What are the experimental techniques to study language?
Oh, everything that you use for studying any other cognitive function for that matter. So basically fMRI, EEG, eye tracking, then you have behavioral experiments for that matter. um, fMRI studies are seen more nowadays. If you see like post um, 2015 or 2016 research, uh, and then it is also kind of plugged in with an EEG study or something like that to support it. But basically, understanding the functional use of language, because as I said, the modularity approach is kind of dying down a bit. So, just to understand how the multiple areas are involved, fMRI studies or the functional approach kind of helps better than the other approaches.
Do you think there are any neuropsychological tests
Yeah.
for any neuropsychological test for studying? I mean, checking language area and if there's a stroke in that area, if anyone had.
Oh, yeah. So basically, in stroke patients, you can see if you can get an MRI and you can see the structural damages, it's very easy to lay out if it is in language dominant areas. So if it's closer to, you say, the anterior temporal lobe, or if you see the typical Broca's of the Wernicke's side, or you see the typical articulate facilicus kind of area, or there are certain areas, if you see structural damage in, then you know what has to be addressed. So the question, so if you know the Broca's experiment, it's super famous, the the person can only produce 10 10 10 10 10 answer to everything that was being asked. uh, and that is how they understood that there was a production deficit. So you can have kind of structural insights, and that will help based on the language dominant areas. But no, if you want to see impairments in language as a whole, it becomes a problem. But then there are different disorders too, right? Like dyslexia and dysgraphia and all of those things, which kind of are not based on lesions, but you can see that they kind of affect language in a broader way, rather than the lesion kind of problems.
Okay, so on to next question. So, how are abstract and concrete concepts represented in brain?
Oh, this is very interesting. Something that I have been working for a while now. Um, there is nothing like whatever I know so far. Nothing like one-to-one mapping of abstract or concrete concepts in the brain. So if you have seen certain interesting literature, so if you know this idea of Maluma and Takiti, the Ramchandran kind of idea, where if you hear certain kind of sounds, it again goes back to sound symbolism and how that works. If you see that there are certain kind of intuitive ways of predicting how the language would work, but that does not necessarily mean that you have typical areas which lit up only based on the abstraction or the concretization of a concept. If you see language, just like leave it, the brain correlates of it. Just think about language in itself. Can you actually define an abstract and a concrete concept? It's extremely difficult. Any concept has all sorts of elements, and all the concrete concepts that we know of are based on multiple assumptions. So kind of the idea of concreteness is also tricky. Yeah.
Okay. So, next question. Could you please suggest any cognitive and language related diagnostic criteria for autism during early onset?
Early onset, if you see autism, if you know that language or speech comes much later, that's one of the biggest indications of diagnosing autism. The speech comes much later, but it's always linked with eye contact or the physical gestures. So language, if you see, it's not just the way you speak. It's a lot about gestures too. You cannot speak without moving. It's very difficult. Your face moves, your hands move, everything moves. But if you see autistic children, especially when they're actually even developing language, which is later than the usual toddlers, uh, they will have reservations in using these gestures. So that can be one of the indications. That's all I know about autism and language research in early onset kind of thing.
So, on to next question. There are
Yeah.
studies which show prosody associated with non-dominant hemisphere.
Yes.
How critical is it?
Um, it is, like I said, the pragmatics for that matter, like I said, is actually represented in the right temporal areas where the reasoning and decision making kind of decision making not so much, but reasoning is being processed. And prosody, yes, being a part of it is processed in that area, but there are very few studies which have exclusively studied prosody. It has always been in relation to either semantics or pragmatics. So based on where you are pitching it, you will get where the brain activation is. It's very difficult to remove prosody from the phrase or structure processing when it comes to experiments, because you need to give certain kind of stimuli. You can't just give prosody. It's an abstract concept that you can understand in linguistics, but it's difficult to kind of pitch it as a stimuli.
Okay. So the next question is asked by Shreya Mohapatra. Her
Yeah.
question is, what are the differences in monolingual language processing versus bilingual or multilingual processing?
There is definitely significant difference. If you see, there are these things that are called about concepts, right? So the language structures that we know are of, what structural linguistics is studying, it's kind of pre-linguistic. That's what we say. Because language does not exist in a structure. We formed that structure for ourselves. We kind of learned the study. We took a very bottom-up approach of understanding language. We know a language completely, and then we deciphered it and then linked back it to the brain. We did not do it the other way around. So, yeah. Okay, I missed the question. Sorry. I can't hear you.
What are the challenges encountered by the visually impaired children while
No,
learning
no,
another
I
language?
was still answering the monolingual bilingual. I'm sorry. Yeah. So in the monolinguals and bilinguals, if you see that the concepts and the way the concepts are formed are extremely different. For example, there are certain words in certain languages which do not have a literal translation in other languages. Um, Say there are words like ame and amok in Japanese, which means one means that extreme aggression, anger, and outrage, which is loosely translated in English, and one means extreme love or care towards your family or someone that you love. But we do not have a typical phrase that can be used in any other language like that. So concepts if you see, or even Borfian hypothesis for that matter, if you know of, that speech comes based on what you think. So, and language determines speech, determines language. So there is an interaction of that. So if there are multiple languages, definitely your concepts are being set in a different manner. You have different schemas, and accordingly, the language will be processed differently.
Okay. So, what do you think about the emotional language hypothesis? As in, if one is monolingual or the first language is switch your emotions to, or something like that?
Um, Yes, that does work, and that is again related to the answer that I just gave about
Yeah.
how certain concepts are formed through certain languages. So definitely they will be more relatable. I think most of Indian students would relate that. If you know that when you started into academia, you do not start thinking in English in the first place. You always think in your mother tongue or something that you're familiar with, your own language, and then you translate it in English. And eventually, when you grow in academia and you get acquainted with academic English and those kind of things, you start thinking in English again. So there are different categories where our thinking is happening. So suddenly, if somebody speaks to me in a newly learned foreign language, I would not feel the same emotions because most of my cognitive resources are being directed towards what it takes to even process the basic components of that sentence or the phrase, and the concept and the content kind of comes much later on. But while it comes to your own language, you start using it as a tool to access your own thoughts and emotions. So it becomes a very different kind of function altogether.
Okay. So we'll start with the next question. Uh, what are the challenges encountered by visually impaired children while learning another language, apart from their mother tongue?
So visually impaired children, what I know of is the language that they hear and speak has a different representation than the language that they learn through braille, like the braille, the written part of it. Uh, so technically, these two are different languages for them, even if it's say English stayed spoken and heard, as opposed to written in braille. So then that is a challenge itself for them because they get used to understanding and the comprehending the world with just two modes. modularities, just two sensations, and it becomes then difficult to accommodate a new sensation, and that sensation gets kind of linked with what this new language is. The I think biggest difficulty they would have, or they have in general, in terms of switching this, is their cognitive resources are attached to these two sensory modularities, and then they have to shift to a new one and attach one to the another. It's same like you study one language and then you study another language and kind of link both of them to understand the concepts that you know of. It might be a similar kind of a difficulty.
Okay. So the next question is, how can one learn a new language faster and efficiently?
Okay, very quick thing I would say is, do not rely on these new apps that come that tell you, you can learn language through app in a month or 2 months. It doesn't work like that. You can learn some words, you can learn some structures, you can learn some phrases, but that does not mean you can learn a language. um, there is actually no quick way of learning a language, but there are certain mnemonics, like we say, that would help. There are certain practices that would help. One is always studying language in a context. So if you see movies, or if you talk to people, or if you try to do it in like an experiential way, the language comes faster. So if you know the idea of pigeons, like there are different languages that come together, and both of them do not know about each other's languages, and a new language is formed. What happens there? It's basically you develop your own structure. When a context comes where you need to pick up a new structure of language, where you need something to communicate, you pick it up better, as opposed to if you remember your school grammar classes where nothing makes sense. Past participle, present participle, blah blah blah, it all goes over the head. So if taught structurally, then it does not go, because it again is pre-linguistic. We do not understand concepts in terms of structures, though we can study them in terms of structures. So best way is learn it in a context. Just go watch movies or talk to people.
Okay. Uh, so the next question is, you talked about neuroplasticity in language production.
Yes, yes, yes.
If all the four lobes are involved in it, how is Broca's area special, and why does Broca's aphasia completely destroy the capability to speak?
Yes, so that's what I said. There are language dominant areas. I am not discarding that Broca's area is not important in production. But that does not mean that in case if you have a region in Broca's area, you will never be able to produce language again. And that is what new aphasia and aphasia therapy, kind of is trying to prove, that you might not be able to gain all the parts of production of in the speech, but that does not mean that you will completely lose speech production if you focus on the multifunctional aspect of that area. You can build it up through it. So yeah, it will damage in a certain way, definitely more than other areas, but not completely.
Okay, the next question is a stuttering problem associated with any impairment in language specific areas of the brain?
Not that I know of. Rather, it's more of a motor issue rather than a speech issue. Yeah.
Okay. The last question for this session is,
Yeah.
what is your current research work at IIT Gandhinagar in linguistics? Since you have
Okay.
talked about the need for integrating language parameters with cognitive brain
Yes.
function.
Yes, I'm definitely working on exactly that. I'm working on this philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. So he was one of the proponents which kind of brought referential linguistics into a highlight uh, during and post Second World War, but it did not gain so much importance because it remained, kind of close towards analytic philosophy and did not come into other areas of linguistics and structural linguistics or opposing it in a certain way. But the insights that is there in his research are exactly what we need to fill the gaps what we need to structure pragmatics and semantics, and I'm working on developing that model and trying to see how semantics and pragmatics can be integrated in this mainstream research where structural linguistics is dominating in brain sciences. Yeah,
Okay. So, thank you for that was the last
yeah,
question. Thank you for being there at such a short notice.
yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
I came to the news that you prepared for a presentation in 10 hours. It was a brilliant session.
Thank you.
And I thank you on the behalf of Brain Awareness Week team, IBRO, and other organizations, Dana Foundation, who are funding us. So I also thank the listeners for asking such insightful questions.
Yeah,
Uh,
it was great.
I hope this seminar answered some of their questions.
Yeah,
Uh, so thank you, ma'am.
yeah. Thank you for this. It was wonderful talking to you. All right.
So for the next session is scheduled from 5 to 6 p.m. It'll be with Miss Meghna Srivastava as she will be discussing suspects counter interrogation strategies. So everyone, please be there for the next session. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.